All right, it is noon central, Wisconsin time at least. Don't know what time it is by everybody else, unless you tell me your time zone. And we're going to do another political theory and practice discussion. This one is going to be oriented in some classical political theory, but it's stuff that I've been reading and thinking about for about 20 years and finding quite helpful. So it might turn out to be helpful or useful for some of you. And what I'm referencing is Aristotle's Politics. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the Nicomachean Ethics and the rhetoric, because that can often be quite helpful to compare things to when you're looking at the politics. But the main thing that I'm interested in talking about here is differing conceptions of justice, of the just and the unjust, which is one of the main modes for Aristotle of what we call moral qualities, categories, right? The just and the unjust, the dikaion and adikon. Um, we have the beautiful and the ugly, or the noble and the base, the foul and the fine, however you want to translate the kalon and aischron. We have the good per se as the agathon and the bad as the kakon. We have the useful or the beneficial and the harmful. We have a lot of other moral qualities as well. And politics really centers in significant amount around what's just, what's right, what is not just advantageous or profitable, the sumferon, right? But the just, the unjust, who should be rewarded, who should be punished, how should we divide things? And Aristotle thinks that this stuff is pretty complicated. And we can go into some of that in a bit, why it's so complicated, the ambiguity of justice. But I want to start with a passage from his famous book 5, which is about stasis or faction. When societies break down into their rival, you can call them factions, you can call them parties, you can call them whatever you want to. That's what was a great danger in Greek city-states, and not just Greek ones, but others. I mean, Aristotle's comparative analysis extends beyond the Greek world to Carthage and places like that. And one of the things that he says that we can really, take home and bank has to do with the rich and the many. So he says, um, democracy arose from people thinking that if they're equal in any respect, they're equal absolutely. For they suppose that because they are all alike free, they are equal absolutely. They're equal in all respects, right? Oligarchy arose from from assuming that if they're unequal as regards some one thing, they're unequal wholly. For being unequal in property, they assume that they are unequal absolutely. And the oligarchs assume that they're better, of course, than everybody else. And then the Democrats claim as being equal to participate in all things in equal shares, while the oligarchs, as being unequal, seek to have a larger share, for a larger share is unequal. Now, here's where it gets really, really interesting. Aristotle goes on to say, all of these forms of constitution have some element of justice. They have some degree of justice. In the Greek, it's echousi men un ti pasai dikaion, some justice, right? Ti dikaion, a little bit of it. But from an absolute point of view, they are erroneous. That is, they're going astray. And owing to this cause, when each of the two parties has not got the share in the Constitution which accords with the fundamental assumption that they happen to entertain, class war, stasis, ensues. And so, what is the issue here? People are mistaken about justice, and they're confused about what justice really consists in, and they get something partly right. There's something to their viewpoint. They're not like totally wrong. They're not absolutely diabolical or anything like that. But the part that they get right, they blow up into the totality of the only things that matter. Now, when you put it that way, I think that you can start to see some implications, not just for ancient Greece, not just for the ancient world in general, but for societies all over the place. You can also apply this to relationships. We're not going to worry too much about personal relationships in this. We're thinking more about society and the political, right? So that's a key insight, that people are often going to get things wrong by taking their perspective as if it's the perspective. And Aristotle actually doesn't say that everybody's perspective is just as good as everybody else's, or we all need something to fill things in. He's not doing the giant thing about the blind men and the elephant or anything like that. He's saying, listen, in society, we are going to have groups, and they are going to get things partly right, and they're going to push for their point of view. And they're also probably going to look at their opponents as, trying to do something wrong and not recognize the rightness in their side. And we can apply this to many complex societal problems. Now, he goes on a little bit further, and he brings in the other thing that I really want to talk about in this case. He says, owing to this cause, when each of the two parties has not got the share in the Constitution, which accords with the fundamental assumption, the mindset that they happen to entertain, class war ensues. And of all people who excel in those who excel in virtue would most justifiably stir up faction, though they are the least given to do so. For they alone can with the fullest reason be deemed absolutely unequal. And there are some men who, being superior in birth, claim unequal rights because of their inequality. For people who have ancestral virtue and wealth behind them are thought to be noble. And Aristotle actually doesn't think that's the case, right? He is not a proponent of dynasty or dynasteia in Greek, right? So he brings in this term, the virtuous, the best, the aristoi. And, we need to be very, very clear about what he means in this case in talking about them. He doesn't mean the people who have money. You can have money and be a total, scumbag. He doesn't mean the people who have celebrity. He doesn't mean the people who even, have high IQ tests or anything like that. He means the people that have developed moral virtue, and not just whatever bullshit happens to pass for moral virtue in one's class or one's church or one's, school or something like that. Real moral virtue, the genuine article, which oftentimes is not all that recognized. It's very easy to talk about people being courageous for the stands they take when a lot of them are actually cowards. Genuine courage, according to Aristotle, should entitle you to a greater role in decision-making in the political community. But, and this is a paradox, the people who actually are virtuous, and very often we get mixed up about who these are, the people who genuinely are virtuous are the ones who have the greatest claim to upset the apple cart and rearrange things so that they're in charge. They're also the least likely to do that. Why? Because they also are the ones who tend to be holding the society together, doing the real work behind the scenes. And Aristotle is going to talk about some things, along these lines at different points in the politics, particularly in Book 4. He talks about, here we go. We often get mistaken into thinking that, there's basically the rich and the many, or the rich and the poor. And he says the fact that the rich are usually few and the poor many makes these two among the parts of the state appear as opposite sections, so that the superior claims of these classes are even made guiding principles on which constitutions, and he means like arrangements. Now, he doesn't mean like a written constitution like the US Constitution. He means the way in which regimes are structured, the politeia in that case. It makes that seem to be two main types. And Aristotle thinks that's actually a mistake. A little bit later in it, he says there are three things or three values, tria esti, right? That have that claim equal participation in the political arrangement. Freedom, everybody's supposed to be free, eleutheria, right? Wealth, or property, and virtue. And then he says, for the fourth, what is called nobility accompanies the two latter. Nobility means ancient wealth and virtue, right? So Aristotle's kind of analyzing nobility and then dismissing it in a way that I think is quite useful. And he says, it is manifest that the mixture of the two factors, the rich and the poor, ought to be termed constitutional government, while the mixture of the three factors deserves the name of aristocracy, most of all the various forms of aristocracy beside the true and best form, which is an ideal that isn't realized anywhere in Greece, he says at the time, which would be like a genuine meritocracy. When we use this word meritocracy, that's often an ideological blind for those who were lucky enough to win the lottery in life being given the slots, right? Or those who happen to have found the right buttons to push to get themselves in as a token of, some sort of reparation that has to be made. We don't have an awful lot of real meritocracies out there. Academia is a prime example. I was just remarking today that, people who think that elite institutions and the people that work at elite institutions are actually better than other places just don't have enough experience, or we're blinded by it because people aren't any smarter at Harvard than they are at Marquette University. They just have more prestige. They just tell themselves interesting stories that other people back up, and they have a massive endowment. That's not a real meritocracy. A real meritocracy would involve intellectual virtue and moral virtue, and we would have to have some way of ensuring and determining that. So that's a bit of an ideal. We'll put that to the side. Aristotle is being much more realistic about something else. We have to have some people. They're almost like, the proverbial biblical salt of the earth, right? We have to have the virtuous within society, and we have to have a certain number of them, or else things are going to fall apart into class conflict and war. The virtuous provide the sort of mediating factor. And what does this mean? Well, societies in which the politics is basically about competing parties, that none of which, I said neither because I'm thinking about the US situation, but we could talk about parliamentary systems in which there's, multiple parties. Unless one of those parties actually contains, quite visibly more virtuous people, which is usually not the case. I mean, we can say one party contains more vicious people, but unless we actually see that, we can't vote simply along party lines and hope that things are going to get better and better. And that, Aristotle would say that that's a real mistake. He also tends to think, and maybe there's something to this, that, the middle class is where we're actually going to find more virtue. This is a classic idea that runs from antiquity all the way into the present, including people, by the way, like Machiavelli. Machiavelli thinks that the rich are always going to be a bunch of jerks, and they're going to try to humiliate and oppress the poor, but you can't trust the poor either. And we could go on and on and on with this sort of line, but it's interesting to see this pointed out. He also says that this is another nice thing, or quote by him: every state consists of both quality and quantity. By quality, I mean freedom, wealth, education, paideia, good birth, and by quantity, the superior numbers of the multitude. And we have to attend to both of these. These both have to be judged in comparison with each other, he thinks. And so, what are we discussing here? If we want a state, especially if we're talking about something really big like a nation state, which is identified with a certain culture or set of cultures, and a society and economic systems and things like that to continue to function well, or not to just fall apart completely, we would have to, as Aristotle says, attend to how you actually get virtue in there and how you keep the people who are basically non-virtuous or vicious from pushing their own agendas, which could be economic agendas. We just want, low taxes so we don't have to pay taxes. Or they could be agendas of hate, or they could be agendas of, sort of basic foolishness. We need to be rivals to every other country in the world and have a massive military. There could be a lot of ways in which things go wrong, and people end up being vicious and end up enacting policies that are vicious. Probably one of the biggest ones in our society, in American society, is our lobbying system, which allows corporations to have so much sway over both parties, and that makes it very difficult to enact legislation that would actually be to the benefit of the people rather than the benefit of the big donors and corporations and things like that. So this is a really interesting idea that Aristotle is putting forward. And Aristotle, when it comes to politics, he's not a realist in the sense of realist political theory. I actually think that a lot of realists are quite idealist. But he is realistic about what keeps societies functioning and the need to, and there's no one single way that you can turn attention to virtue. Any little, campaign that you would do is always going to get co-opted by the people who are non-virtuous for their agendas. So it requires a lot of work, and it's all really subject to what the ancients called fortuna. So, all right, let's take some of these questions. I said I would talk for about 20 minutes and then address questions and things like that. So a lot of people saying lovely day for a lecture. It's pretty nice here in Milwaukee. Dawid says, what do you think about the current crisis on the Poland-Belarus line? I don't actually know enough about it to think about it. I haven't been looking at it. It looks like it's sort of Belarus manufacturing a crisis deliberately, and Belarus has been a bad actor. Belarus and its dictator. I mean, if you're looking at Aristotle, what would Belarus be? It would be a tyranny, right? And it's been a tyranny for a long time, basically kept in place as a satellite state by Putin. So hopefully, someday they'll get a new government. All right. Joe Manchin is one of those cowards masquerading as a courageous moderate. Yeah, there aren't any courageous moderates out there right now, frankly. Most people who call themselves moderates, it's sort of like the Scooby-Doo thing. You pull off the mask, they turn out to be right-wingers. It's unfortunate that the language has gotten so corrupted and co-opted, but moderate, constitutional liberal, all those things basically are just, old school right-wing, and they're not that distinguishable from what the right has turned into in America. So MC1 says, would the virtuous act within classes or outside of class boundaries? Well, both, right? I mean, it depends on what you mean by within classes or outside of class boundaries. They are going to be found all over the place, and they may not be able to coordinate. And a lot of their actions are not going to be like grand political theater or anything like that. It's going to be doing the right thing as one of the archons of the city, somebody who makes sure that the garbage actually gets picked up or stuff like that. Again, if you look at Aristotle, he gets down to the nitty gritty of what cities need. He in book 6, for example, he goes through cities have to have this, they have to have this, they have to have this. Parisia, is this from Aristotle's book Politics? Yeah, this is from the Politics books 4 and book 5. Hypatia, so few virtuous people left, mostly fanatics and self-serving manipulators. I think there's plenty of virtuous people out there. The trouble is that we live in a very fragmented society, and most times that people act virtuously, they're not doing so to try to get a lot of celebrity or to have the local news come out and see them. And, the moral vocabulary, as Alistair McIntyre has pointed out, has become incredibly corrupted as well. So I think there are plenty of virtuous people. Martin Hing, the idea that virtuous people are hiding away from public discourse seems like wishful thinking. I mean, how the hell would you know that? Have you done some sort of massive survey? I mean, to attribute wishful thinking to somebody when you don't actually know them is kind of a funny starter, isn't it? Does Aristotle substantiate these claims? Claims made about his own time? I mean, read the politics. I think you can answer that for yourself. You might want to think about why that was your go-to. Damon says Aristotle seemed to favor tyranny. Completely wrong. Was he just catering to his sponsors? Who do you think his sponsors were? I mean, at the time that he's writing this, is Alexander the Great a massive sponsor? He's actually in disagreement with Alexander about how Alexander ought to treat the Persians. So I don't know where you got this idea that Aristotle is a proponent of tyranny. It can't be from reading this book, because that ain't the case. He's very clearly in favor of what he's calling aristocracy, and he says tyranny is one of the worst of regimes. So, yeah. Ed, protocol number 1, men with bad instincts are more in number than the good. I don't know what you mean by protocols, but maybe you're talking about assumptions. And Aristotle doesn't say that that's automatically the case. It depends on the society, right? All right, Luke says, I think it might be that the virtuous talk less or less loudly than the self-serving. Yes, and that is part of it. When you look at the motivations that people have for engaging in behavior that is not simply self-serving, but helping other people out, sometimes requiring sacrifices. I mean, doing your job diligently inevitably involves sacrifices, right? Getting into public discussions, knowing what the hell you're talking about. Not, just to take a recent example, the Washington Post published some moron who's a Princeton professor, claiming that Kant is doing critical race theory. And you can't get any dumber than that now, can you? Or lazier as a scholar. People who do their due diligence. Now we're talking more about intellectual virtue than moral virtue. But I mean, I think lying in public forums is probably morally vicious, right? So it's always easier for the vicious to do their thing. Virtue requires a lot of work and sacrifice. And yeah, so the virtuous have less time to talk about their stuff. They're not always on social media, saying, "Oh, I'm so great." And this applies not just to Aristotelian virtue or Platonic virtue, but Stoic virtue and Christian virtue. You look at like who's singing their own praises, and then who's getting their praises sung by people who actually know something about it, not just a bunch of people who buy their coaching sessions or something like that, right? R.T. Whitby, do you agree with Aristotle? A philosopher would be the best ruler. So Aristotle doesn't think that. You've got it mixed up with Plato. Aristotle actually says in book 3 that if you have a person of superlative virtue, and that would, they could arguably be a philosopher, you should in fact let them be king, right? Not tyrant, but king. But this is going to pose you with massive succession problems, right? Because when you have more representative government or collaborative government, people are learning how to become leaders. If you just have one person running the whole show, and then everyone's like, okay, well, this person's really the best, we're going to follow along with them, you don't have people being trained up. And Aristotle, by the way, is also not a big fan of hereditary dynasties. He thinks that those are problematic as well. All right, let's see. Mark says, do you think Aristotelian notion of an aristocracy of excellence can be reconciled with modern notions of democracy, or would it need some rethinking? So both, actually. I mean, Aristotle, so this is going to be a bit of a big picture, thing about Aristotle's works in general. Aristotle is super clear that he is providing us with outlines. He is not providing us with the total system We have to do the intellectual work of filling them in. And a lot of the stuff that he has to say is underdetermined and requires us to engage in some thinking ourselves, which is part of the goal of doing political theory, or of doing ethics, or thinking about the persuasion involved in rhetoric. We shouldn't just be mindless automatons following a laid out axiomatic system. We also do have to adapt it to modern times. Aristotle is writing about now 2,400 years ago. A lot has changed. Even the cities that he's talking about, maybe he didn't get them all right in his own time. So we have to adapt, and this is what people have been doing throughout the years with the Aristotelian tradition. So I think both have to be done. Bottom head, one must accept that one party will always be without virtue. Therefore, the real concern must be for the party that could be corrupted. The Democratic Party is corrupted. I don't know what you're talking about there. I mean, the Republican Party right now is the party almost entirely lacking in virtue. If you're a Republican at this point in time, God help you, because you got to believe so many contradictory, crazy things just to hang out with your fellow nut jobs. The Democratic Party is corrupt, and there's lots of problems with it. But they're, at this point in time, myself as an independent, I vote with them because they're the lesser of the two evils, and occasionally will even surprise you, right? But neither is particularly good at this time. But we don't have to accept that one party will always be without virtue. I mean, we should hope for a two-party or multi-party system in which both parties actually have some virtuous people who can hold back the terrible tendencies that the other members of the party are trying to enact. And unfortunately, pretty much all, anybody who had any virtue in the Republican Party long since lost it or left, all right, Don Key, what about the U.S. founders kind of imagine this will work if there's no political parties? Well, the U.S. the founders were all over the map. They weren't, this is kind of an interesting point too. People always like to appeal to the founders in this semi-religious way. Who gives a shit what they thought, right? We're not living in their time. We're not bound by what they decided. We shouldn't have this quasi, religious attitude towards them to begin with. Or if we're going to, we should actually know what the hell they said, so we don't embarrass ourselves claiming all sorts of things about the founders that the founders themselves would if they were here, they'd bitch slap the people saying it, right? But the founders were kind of a mix and a mess, right? They're all over the map on this. The Federalist Papers are written partly in response to the Anti-Federalist Papers, right? And they include everybody from very conservative people to Tom Paine. So I don't think that looking at the founders is particularly helpful here. All right, Ed Keeley, have you read The Juvenile? Yeah, a long time ago, but I don't know how that's going to be helpful here. And let's see. All right, R.T. Whitby, psychologists claim that people who want to rule others are in general bad people. Well, I mean, any blanket claim like that about psychologists is going to be wrong, and I don't see how that's particularly helpful. Sometimes wanting to rule people is actually a great idea. I mean, think about the classic thing of, I need to be in charge so other people don't screw it up even more than they're going to. The penalty for not engaging in politics, Plato points this out, Rousseau points this out, other people point it out, is you leave it to the dummies and the hucksters to decide what's going to happen. Wanting to exercise power over other people, you have to ask, what is the motive? What are you trying to get out of it? Could it be for their benefit? Could it be just because you want to make a lot of money? I mean, these are very different ways of doing that. Bottomhead, Kant was racist. Yeah, who doesn't know that? I mean, that's pretty much public knowledge at this time. So is Hegel. Yeah, so what? if you read critical theory, you're a Kantian. That's probably joking around, right? Because it's Kant is not a critical theorist in the sense that critical theory is. Skullsgate, is the philosopher still the best ruler in Plato's laws, or is that just in the Republic? Also, how does the polity differ from democracy and prevent tyranny of demagoguery? So I'll answer the second one. When you're talking about polity, what you're talking about is Aristotle's sort of mixed regime. How does it differ from democracy? Aristotle tells you how the three good regimes differ from the three bad regimes. So this is a general answer. The three bad regimes are being ruled for the benefit of those who rule. So if you have a democracy, it's whoever winds up winning, they arrange things in terms of legislation and the executive, and Aristotle wouldn't really worry about the judicial, but we can think about that in this time for their benefit. So in present day politics, when the one party wins, they totally reward their donors and punish, the people on the other side, and then, vice versa. Aristotle considers all that degenerate regimes. A genuine polity, or a good democracy, if you want to use that sort of framework, would be where the rulers who have been elected by popular whatever we're going to do it, electorally, consent, something like that, are ruling for the benefit of the totality of the society, which doesn't preclude, by the way, going after criminals or, taxing people or anything like that, right? So that's how those differ. How does it prevent tyranny of demagoguery? I mean, I don't know what you mean by tyranny of demagoguery. Tyranny is often, demagogues are often tyrants, right? When they get in charge. But, the polity doesn't prevent it. The polity is a different regime. And so if you want to hold on to that regime, you have to look. I mean, Aristotle provides you with suggestions about how you keep regimes from breaking down in, books 4 and book 5. So that's where you'd want to look at it. All right. Made of clay, could we say Republicans are honest or public in their evil? I mean, public. I don't know what honest evil means. So sure. Ed Keeley, both parties are completely controlled and illegitimate. That's a silly thing to say. And if you think the juvenile is more than applicable in this discussion, spell it out, buddy, because it's been a long time since I've taken a look at that. Mike says, was Foucault right in that man or woman as a category is disappearing? What do you think? Can you tell whether people are men or women? Or is Foucault right that it's gradually disappearing? I mean, I don't really have too much trouble with that myself. Maybe it's because I live here in a less cutting edge state and city of Milwaukee, but yeah, that one's kind of a non-starter there. Mark, I noticed Hobbes doesn't make the distinction between good and bad forms of constitutions. Neither does Locke. Why do you think this distinction was lost? Well, it was lost in them. It wasn't necessarily lost, universally. And, Hobbes is very anti-Aristotelian. He not only is anti-Aristotelian, he's also really down on Plato and on Cicero. He names all three of them as people whose works should be banned by the Commonwealth that would be dominated by the sovereign in Leviathan, right? Because the sovereign doesn't just preserve the peace, they also decide what doctrines can be taught. And Hobbes thinks that lots of people are using Aristotle for nefarious ends of faction, right? And there's probably something to that, right? You can write about Aristotle and cherry pick the stuff and not really, deal with politics in a genuinely Aristotelian way. Aristotle was used, for example, by pre-Civil War political theorists in the South, not just to justify slavery, but to justify all sorts of other things as well that were quite bad. But they were bad Aristotle readers, deliberately so, right? All right. Boy, Ed is really weighing in with a lot of weird stuff here. The left wants you to think the categories of men and women are disappearing. I don't know where you're getting this crap from, but that's pretty bizarre. I know a lot of people on the left, and they don't seem to want to think that the categories of men and women are disappearing. So, um, if you don't like, by the way, if you don't like the comments that I'm making, you can leave, because this is like my front porch here. All right. So, Massacre, what do you think of techno feudalism that might happen? Do you think billionaires should have that much power, especially here? Yeah. So, I think that the corporation, and I think that the ultra rich pose new problems for political theory. And this is something very important. Is the corporation something like a political community? If it is, then it's definitely an oligarchy or a tyranny. Very rarely a monarchy or an aristocracy, right? And these people that are in this international super rich, who very often are driving decisions made by governments, and own media empires, and also perpetuate themselves over and over again. This is not something radically new. My dad, when I was a kid, had a book on his shelf called The Rich and the Super Rich. And I remember reading it when I was in high school. And it was about how, the people that you think are the rich, they're not really that rich. There is an entire class of people, and it went into incredible statistical analysis about this, that are managing to pass on their money and stuff like that. And they have new people joining them who own an innovative company and build it up. And this is very, from an Aristotelian problem or perspective, this is incredibly problematic, right? Because they have incredible control over people's destinies. I mean, and we have this massive stratification. Aristotle thought that is a sign of a sick and dying city state, or in his time, or culture and society in our time. These massive, wealth distinctions, which are also power distinctions. I mean, somebody else to look at on that is Rousseau. If you've got money, you can buy power, you can buy prestige. So this is something that we do have to think through. Hypatia, I don't think the younger generation cares anymore. Well, I mean, these vast, broad generalizations are almost always false. I mean, I teach the younger generation, so my experience is not that they don't care anymore. My experience is that they often feel themselves to be screwed and powerless, and the main thing that they have to fight against is despair. R.T. Whitby, did Aristotle think that having power leads to becoming vicious? No, he doesn't think that there's sort of an automatic progression from gaining power to being vicious. But he does think that if you are vicious or have tendencies towards it, he actually talks about being a cratic, having a loss or lack of control in book 4. If you're given power, you're probably going to screw up, and that's going to be bad, not just for you and not just for your immediate, let's call them victims, the people that you're doing injustice to. That's going to be bad for society in general. So you can have good people get into power, and then they can fix things. They can make things better, not like a utopian way, but to some degree making things better. And that's what Aristotle really wants to see happening in cities. And by the way, he says in the Politics, and he is the guy who did empirical studies of all these Greek city-states. He says not a single one of them is really a well-run city at this point. That's sobering, isn't it? So, here's an interesting thing from MC1. Do you think Rawls successfully reconciles meritocracy and equality? I mean, in theory, yes, but when are we ever placed in something like a Rawlsian veil of ignorance, where we would, then go through this experiment and choose the difference principle, and when I try it out with my classes, I don't get the results that Rawls does, which tells me a lot that like either Rawls was kind of making it up, or it has something to do more with like doing thought experiments like that with students at elite schools who are not representative of students, worldwide. I mean, it's Rawls is enunciating something that really sounds awesome, doesn't it? We have a fairly equal society with respect to opportunity and other things, and then we have differences between people. We have inequalities, but they're not going to be like massive inequalities, and they're basically open to anybody to get in there. So the doctor can get paid more than the orderly, because the doctor is, it's to the benefit of the society, and it's also to the benefit of the worst off. That's another key thing in Rawls's approach. But we almost never see anything like that, unfortunately, So, all right, Emily, what is justice, and do you think the presocratics can help us in finding guidance for political formation? So, Aristotle, who we're talking about here, says that justice is something that has multiple meanings, and this is why we get so screwed up about it. If you want to look at some of what Aristotle says about justice, you want to go to Nicomachean Ethics, book 5. And then you want to supplement it with what he says in the Politics and what he says in parts of the Rhetoric and other parts, obviously, of the Nicomachean and Eudemian ethics. Justice is polysemous. It's ambiguous. It has a number of different meanings. So there isn't any what is justice. There's what are the different kinds of justice. And do I think the presocratics can help us in finding guidance? Not at all. I don't think the presocratics have much to offer us on that, with the exception of maybe Solon. If you want to lump him in there, he's got some good stuff in his poems, that he says about justice in the city and stuff like that. But most of what we have from the presocratics is fragmentary and isn't really focused on politics. It's focused on, if you had to pick one thing, it's focused on metaphysics, right? So there isn't that much to work with. People find the presocratics kind of sexy because they're ambiguous and you can make all sorts of cool stuff out of them, but so much of it is very speculative. That's why we read people like Aristotle or Plato or Seneca or Cicero or these other great thinkers, because we have their stuff. Mike, do Marxists and fascists fit into the left-right liberal paradigm, or should they be considered separate from it? Neither and both, kind of. People like to sometimes, so like when I was in high school, here's what they would do. They would say, we've got a political spectrum, and it's like a line, right? And in the middle, obviously, are like moderates. And then we have liberals, and we have conservatives, and then we have radicals, and we have reactionaries. And, reactionaries, well, the fascists would fit in there, and socialists or Marxists or pick whatever else, they would be radicals, right? And that's a nice story we tell ourselves, but things are, of course, way more complicated than that. I mean, in general, fascists are on the right. Sometimes they have policies or use language that is of the left, but they're usually persecuting people on the left. So that should tell you what the hell's going on. And, if a Marxist is somehow on the right, I think they probably at some point quit being a Marxist, right? So, yeah. Piffall says, should our political disagreement play out in an agonistic setting? Well, as opposed to what? I mean, it always does play out in an agonistic setting. Wouldn't it be nice if things were less agonistic? Yeah. But even even going, so we're really in a bad way here in America now, right? Things are very polarized. Compared to what I can remember from the 70s and the 80s. And they were polarized then as well, but not to the degree they are now. But it was still really agonistic back then. So I don't know. I mean, maybe if we're talking about local politics, it's not quite so agonistic, at least in some places. But it's kind of tough to imagine a politics that wouldn't be, Um, here's here's a good one. Um, from Mark. Should we eat the rich? Was Aerosmith right? I think Motorhead has an eat the rich too, right? And so does Crocus. I think it's kind of a popular um, theme, at least in metal. I don't know if it is in other genres, but should we eat the rich? Um, I mean, assuming that we resorted to cannibalism, um, they might not be, they might not be very healthy to eat. Then again, some of them have pretty good hygiene and healthcare and stuff like that. So I don't know. I mean, here we get into a lot of practicalities. I mean, what we ought to do is we ought to tax the rich fairly, right? We really ought to get rid of all these dodges that people use to, because when taxes are not distributed fairly, they're going to get distributed on somebody, and they wind up hitting the poor and the middle class, what there is still of it, much harder, and it makes it difficult to have any real social mobility, and it creates a lot of injustices. If you think about what led to the French Revolution, one major thing that led to it was that taxes were basically displaced from the upper classes onto the lower classes on things like salt, or the number of windows that you'd have in your house. So they promoted some very unhealthy ways of living, and people lost a lot of what they would have. Made of Clay says, why do conservatives fall into conspiracy, at least in today's political climate? That's a great question. I don't actually have a great answer for that. All I see is the train wreck of it happening. And, we're dealing with the COVID pandemic, and we're dealing with an earlier pandemic of viruses that have gotten into people's minds and turned them into, in some cases, unrecognizable caricatures of who they were. I know a lot of people who at one time were decent people who I went to school with or were colleagues, and they bought into all this, right-wing conspiracy crap. And and it wasn't all like in one fell swoop, but they've become fairly unrecognizable as the people that they once were. And you look at them and you're like, Jesus, what the this you poor bastards. Except that they're not just poor bastards, they're now like deliberately doing this. There's a kind of viciousness to it, and that's really, it's really troubling. I don't know how we move past that, and I think that's part of why our society, American society, is pretty well screwed going forward. I don't think we're going to get out of this kind of morass that we're in. Let's see here. Rishba says, who is your favorite American founder, best political philosopher? I mean, I don't think I have a favorite founder. I teach them sometimes when I teach American philosophy as part of the, what we call the American Renaissance. But I don't think I have a favorite founder. So Mark asks about Ubuntu. How much do you know about Ubuntu? Some, but not. It's not like a major area of study. But I was sort of like mandated to teach it in some classes, so I had to beef up my knowledge of it. I think there's some interesting intersections between it and some concepts in classical Greek philosophies. I would say that's right. And it's often, and Mark and I have talked about this before, it's often portrayed as if it's like the African ethics, when really Africa is a very diverse place. So William O'Toole, democracy is declining. Do you think this is true? Yeah, I would say that is true, and democracy has been declining for decades. And it's interesting because we have places that when I was a kid were definitely not democracies, and then were able to become democracies or were assimilated into democracies. If you think about the East German state under the communists, right? It became part of West Germany, and then just became Germany. And Germany is a functioning democracy. It's got its challenges, of course, but that happened. I mean, other places that were behind the Warsaw Pact, what we call the Iron Curtain, have become more or less functioning, but sometimes not very functioning. I mean, look at Orban in Hungary. Hungarian civil society has been gutted over the last 10 years. And it's, it's disheartening to see. But it's not as if like democracy itself is just one single thing. I mean, it can be at a lot of different levels. So, all right. Paul says, should we use the moral standards of the historical time period of any particular thinker as a guide to their ideas, or should we apply present day standards to popular historical thinkers? Both. Why wouldn't we do both? And why wouldn't we try to harmonize between them? It's not an either or sort of thing. It's really interesting because people say, oh, Aristotle couldn't have been against slavery because, that was just the common idea at the time. And then obviously they haven't read Politics Book 1, where Aristotle says, now some people say that all slavery is against nature and therefore unjust, right? There were people at the time, they weren't popular decision makers or thinkers or stuff like that. He doesn't name who they were, and we don't know how many they were. So, I mean, we can judge from all different perspectives. The issue is when we're making judgments, are they bullshit judgments? Do we have anything to back them up? Are they just serving our own purposes, our rhetorical purposes? It's not just so like either we judge by their own time standards, which are probably there's a lot of controversy there, or we judge from the present. We have to go deeper, I think. Let's see here. Peter Heil says, what do you think of Varoufakis' statement, we don't live under capitalism, we live in techno feudalism where socialism is for the rich? Again, massively sweeping statement. I don't usually buy into those too much. I mean, it depends on what you mean by techno feudalism. Techno feudalism isn't entirely without capitalism. I just don't find these to be particularly helpful ways of talking about things in the present. As time has gone on, I've become much more of well, let's actually look at what's going on here and then describe what's going on here. Can you say the same things about the United States as you can about Indonesia, as you can about the People's Republic of China, as you can about Saudi Arabia, as you can about Brazil? Can you make the same sweeping assertions about all of these at the same time? I don't know. I mean, people will say, yes, neoliberalism, but when you get that broad, it doesn't actually mean much of anything, right? Rodrigo, can you talk a bit about the difference between bios and zoe and Aristotle and the relation of these two terms, the being of the political animal? I think this is overblown. Bios just means a way of life. Zoe means an animal, right? There are some thinkers who have tried to turn them into massively different categories, but that's not Aristotle. Aristotle is concerned about the life and what its conditions are, and then the good life, right? And we are one animal among many. We are the animal that is polity, but we're also the one that's rational and able to, again, read Politics Book 1. We're able to participate in, to form, communities based on moral values in ways that other animals can't, right? Let's see. Test says, I think the way nowadays we understand liberty or freedom has become a problem. I would love to practice the way Aristotle understands freedom and virtues. Yes. And freedom is one of those terms like justice that is highly ambiguous. And I think that there is a pernicious kind of freedom, a conception of freedom as basically I get to do whatever the hell I want because I'm, a good person and privileged, and everybody else should like, they can do what they want so long as it doesn't impinge on me. So don't like make me, I want police protection, but don't tax me. I get to shoot anybody who comes in my yard, and I get to claim that, people are hurting me with what they're saying, but I don't give that to anybody else. It's this kind of screw you, I've got mine freedom. And I'm tempted to think that it's, American in origin, but it isn't really. I think that there's assholes like that throughout the world, throughout time, but it's become particularly centered in this American, this appeal to like freedom and, liberty and all that on the part of people who don't care about other people and often want to try to screw them over if they can. So I think there's something behind that, but I think you can see that a lot in the Tories in Britain at this point in time, and actually a lot of Labour people in Britain too, particularly their leadership, and you see this a lot among people in the business world. So that's not the only conception of freedom that we have, but it's somehow becoming the one that dominates the discourse. So I think we have a lot to work at on that. So I think that's a good insight. Quantum astrologer, is there even a set of values, laws, and economic paradigms which account for the needs of all humans in nature? Why is the dictatorship under a strong supercomputer our only chance? Well, I don't know that that's the case. I mean, that's a non-starter right there. I want to talk about a loaded question, right? Yeah, there's plenty of sets of values, laws, I don't know about economic paradigms, but we're always working at it. And I think that virtue ethics provides us with a lot of useful components for that. Is there like a single book that contains all of it? I don't think so, Let's see here. Dr. Right Life, have you read Dark Persuasion or Twilight of Democracy? I haven't. Also, do you recommend YouTube sites, Sovereign Nations, and New Discourses? Lindsay? I mean, would I recommend him? Yeah, I'd recommend you don't watch his crap because he's an idiot. or at least he's playing an idiot on TV, because holy shit does that guy say stupid stuff, so yeah. I mean, if you are into those kind of people, this probably isn't for you. You got to wean yourself off of that silly crap before you're going to get anything out of reading like Aristotle. So, all right, James, who do you find to be the most compelling character in Plato's Republic? I mean, I don't find characters compelling in dialogues. I'm not sure how that would work. If you ask me about novels, I could tell you. Massacre, how should we view human beings? When should we use hermeneutics, phenomenology, post-structuralism, structural functionism, etc.? Well, I mean, maybe after you've spent a lot of time hanging out with people before you start, getting into all these isms and have a good sense of like human psychology and how things work, and you've got some relationships formed. I mean, I don't know that bringing hermeneutics to bear is automatically going to be very helpful for understanding human beings unless you can connect it to the experiences that you actually have. I don't think that there's any answer to that. Thomas says, do you think the USA is too large to govern? Does Aristotle address the governability of state under this aspect? The United States, and actually almost every country that exists right now, is way, way bigger than what Aristotle was envisioning. I mean, he did have a little bit of input into Alexander's conquests, right? But the stuff that Aristotle had to say doesn't seem to be particularly on point or helpful. He basically said, Alexander, this is in a letter from Plutarch, which may or may not be genuine, right? It says, Alexander, you're screwing up. You're treating these Persians as if they're not automatically slavish people. So he's showing some real ethnocentrism there, which by the way, shows up in the politics, right? Alexander was in some respects more enlightened than Aristotle in his treatment of the conquered peoples and trying to form this empire. Does that mean that we can't use Aristotle to understand things? No, it means that Aristotle himself is not particularly helpful on that. All right, I'm gonna have to get going soon because I gotta do some other recording in a bit. Let's see what we have here. Um, Colamus says, any suggestions for how to incorporate Aristotelian ideas about politics in a sci-fi story? That's interesting. I don't have any like general helpful suggestions. I would say, and I think you could say this about any, if you're writing a sci-fi story, and you want to incorporate some philosophy into it, there's a couple ways you can do it. One is you can like deliberately weave in the thing as like something that you study or some technology that you use, right? Or some discipline. And I mean, you could have like somebody talking about Aristotelian rhetoric, and so you can do what like Dostoevsky does in his novels, which is has people talk philosophy, right? And I mean, you could have like two people on a spaceship talking about Aristotle's politics and saying, oh, this is all kind of passe because, we all live under a totalitarian society. But isn't it cool to think about the idea that there could be, 6 regimes or something like that? The other thing you could do, I guess, would be to like think about the broader topics and then think about how you could weave them in a more subtle, more global way. Um, when I was in grad school, I actually had this pipe dream of writing a novel about a detective who would be the Aristotelian, and he would apply like Aristotelian principles in a very flexible way, not in a schematic way, to like solve crimes and stuff like that. I never did anything on it, of course, because I'm not a fiction writer. So, yeah, but that's actually kind of an interesting idea. Skullsgate, do you teach Plato's laws? No, I generally, I mean, the books that I teach by Plato in my classes are Apology, occasionally the Credo, sometimes the Euthyphro, the Phaedo, bits of the Republic, the Symposium, every once in a while the Gorgias. I don't teach at a place where I would be teaching like graduate students and we would focus just on one text like the laws. Mark has an interesting suggestion here. A sci-fi version of The Name of the Rose where they're hunting for the other part of the poetics that's been lost in the future. Yeah, that could be quite awesome. Just don't give it to Hollywood to screw it up, right? All right. Rodrigo asked, do you think with modernity we lost an important sense of the telos of the political community we need to recuperate? If so, is it possible under the secular nation state? Yeah, possible under the secular nation state. Probably not going to come from the secular nation state. Did we lose something? Yeah, we're always losing something, but we shouldn't romanticize the past. I mean, if you were a slave in Athens, the wonderful Athenian democracy was not, this awesome thing that you were like a little bit of. It probably sucked for you, especially if you were like working in a profession that was going to kill you 20 years younger than you should. So, I mean, we always lose things. Modernity is too big of a thing to say blanket across the board, that this is gone or this is gone or this is gone. We again, I think we have to specify a lot more. All right. So I'm going to bring this to a close and thank everybody for their questions, comments. Some better than others, guaranteed. But discourse is important. Dialogue is important. Like Epictetus says, entering into the hall of a philosopher is like going into a doctor's office. Don't expect it to be necessarily the most fun experience in the world, right? So we'll do another one of these next month. I'll think about what topic I'm going to do. And got a couple other things coming up later in the month. Classic metal class, of course, next next Saturday, if I get around to it, speculative fiction studies on Anathem. Hopefully I'll get that. Otherwise, I may have to put that off till next month. And I'll see all of you somewhere in the ether.